The film kicked off in the desolate, icy expanse of the North Pole, where a pair of geologists, Julia and Oscar, were busy with their experiments, dropping explosives into the frigid waters below. Just as they were at it, Julia's phone buzzed with an urgent call from a colleague, who quickly warned her to halt their work and abandon the site. A massive storm, he cautioned, was bearing down on them fast. Meanwhile, deep beneath the surface, a Russian submarine detected an incredibly loud, unsettling noise emanating from the seabed. Something colossal on the ocean floor started to rise, heading straight for the surface. Back on the ice, Julia's measuring device suddenly went haywire, and ominous cracks began to spiderweb across the ice around their camp. Oscar, quick on the uptake, immediately urged Julia to ditch the place, and they hopped onto a snowmobile, trying to make a hasty escape. But the ice was cracking everywhere, giving way beneath them, and Oscar's snowmobile was violently flung, exploding in a fiery burst. From a distance, their entire campsite could be seen, utterly demolished, nothing left but scattered wreckage. Now Julia and Oscar found themselves stranded, shivering in that unforgiving, frozen wasteland. Down below, the Russian submarine suddenly slammed into something with an alarming jolt. The captain, reacting swiftly, ordered a deeper dive to avoid whatever they'd hit. However, the impact was so brutal that the submarine sustained severe damage. Luckily, just as the vessel began its descent into the abyss, one of the crew members managed to deploy an emergency life raft. They even had time to fire off a flare. And in the fleeting, fiery glow of the explosion, several massive tentacles could be seen writhing ominously around the crippled submarine. The scene then shifted to the Russian Marine headquarters, where the top brass were receiving grim news of their submarine sinking. The stakes were incredibly high. The submarine was carrying a critically important weapon. Their plan was clear: to dispatch a rescue team to retrieve it, or, if that proved impossible, destroy the submarine to prevent its secrets from falling into the wrong hands. This perilous mission was to be spearheaded by Victor Voronin, who, adding a layer of personal drama, was the younger brother of the sunken submarine's captain. Naturally, this news filled Victor's mother and family with dread, terrified that Victor too might meet a tragic end. So as Victor prepared to leave, his mother pressed his father's old watch into his hand, a tangible good luck charm. That evening, Victor arrived at the dock, meeting his father's old friend, Admiral Olshansky, who would also be joining the mission. As Victor stepped aboard the submarine, he overheard many of the crew grumbling. They were annoyed about being called back from leave to join such a dangerous undertaking. But their complaints died on their lips the moment Admiral Olshansky, a figure of authority, made his imposing presence felt. Meanwhile, on the surface, Julia and Oscar were battling through the raging snowstorm, desperately trying to find a signal on their devices. Against all odds, they managed to snag a faint signal, connecting to a nearby oil rig. The blizzard, however, was so fierce that their frantic calls couldn't be heard clearly by the workers. In a last-ditch effort, a desperate Oscar fired a flare into the tumultuous sky before finally collapsing and losing consciousness. The following day, Victor's submarine finally reached the grim coordinates where the initial vessel had vanished, and with a determined hum, it began its deep dive. Simultaneously, Victor and several other high-ranking officers gathered in Admiral Olshansky's quarters, engrossed in what seemed to be a heated discussion. When Victor and the others eventually exited the room, their faces were etched with clear annoyance. Before long, hushed whispers about the strategic approaches they intended to adopt began to ripple throughout the crew. Back on the desolate surface, Julia and Oscar stumbled upon a lifebuoy, the very one that had been released from the ill-fated sinking submarine. Both immediately recognized it as a submarine buoy, equipped with a tracking device. A glimmer of hope flickered, and they decided to hunker down, patiently waiting for a rescue. Down in the depths, at that very moment, Victor's team finally detected a faint signal emanating from the emergency buoy. Without hesitation, they altered course, heading straight towards its location. Mid-journey, a vast pod of whales suddenly materialized, encircling their submarine in a majestic, if perplexing, display. Not wanting to cause any harm to the magnificent creatures, the crew gently directed their submarine downwards. However, during the maneuver, one of the whales accidentally clipped the main propeller cover. Admiral Olshansky, clearly irritated by the incident, curtly instructed to blame the sonar readings, and just as abruptly as they had appeared, the whales swam off. Yet only minutes later, the colossal whale pod returned, once again surrounding their submarine. But their presence was short-lived. Shortly after, the whales abruptly departed, swimming away on their own accord. It became clear this peculiar behavior was triggered by increasingly powerful, low-frequency sounds emanating from the area, signaling that the seabed itself was starting to rise once more. It was the work of a gargantuan tentacle which made its terrifying appearance, dispatching a whale with a single devastating blow. The unsettling presence of this massive creature was acutely felt by the submarine crew. What truly unnerved them, however, was their inability to identify the strange, resonant sounds they were hearing. Meanwhile, the radar began to paint a picture of something enormous hurtling directly towards them. Admiral Olshansky, convinced it was an enemy vessel, vehemently advocated for opening fire. But Victor, ever the cautious leader, remained unconvinced. He argued that if it truly was an enemy, initiating an unprovoked attack would be tantamount to declaring war. Consequently, Victor ordered his crew to defend their position by protecting the narrow gap between massive ice walls. Simultaneously, the sound blaring from the radar intensified, growing deafeningly loud in their ears as the gargantuan creature relentlessly pursued them. With a colossal ice wall looming directly ahead, the crew had no choice but to bring the submarine to a screeching halt, just shy of a catastrophic collision. Thankfully, after a tense few moments, the colossal creature finally moved on, leaving them safe once more. The harrowing encounter, however, had left their submarine significantly damaged. This infuriated Admiral Olshansky, who berated Victor for his stubbornness and willingness to take such reckless risks. A decision was made to ascend to the surface for emergency repairs. Meanwhile, on the desolate ice above, Julia and Oscar, huddled together for warmth, were suddenly startled by the breathtaking sight of the submarine breaching the surface from beneath the icy waters. Victor and the crew disembarked, coming face to face with the two shivering survivors. Victor, ever practical, first confirmed that Julia and Oscar were unarmed. He then listened intently to Julia's incredible tale of how they had managed to reach the emergency lifeboat. However, when Victor discussed their predicament with Admiral Olshansky, the Admiral, suspicious that Julia and Oscar might be spies, curtly ordered Victor to give them some food and then leave them behind in the harsh elements. But Victor wasn't about to abandon two people to the freezing cold without proper vehicles or equipment. Defying the Admiral, Victor extended an invitation, calling for Julia and Oscar to join his team aboard the submarine. After the necessary checks and repairs on the surface, the submarine was cleared to submerge once more. Down below, Julia and Oscar received medical attention and much-needed sustenance. Victor then joined them, seeking more detailed information about their presence at the North Pole. Julia explained that she and Oscar were geologists, conducting research by deploying explosives into the water. Oscar, hearing this, voiced a troubling thought. Perhaps their explosives were what had inadvertently damaged the Russian submarine and caused its sinking. Admiral Olshansky remained firm, advising against continuing the search for the sunken submarine. He emphasized the numerous threats lurking in those deep waters, warning that if their vessel were attacked and damaged, they wouldn't even be able to send out a distress signal. However, Victor was desperate to find his brother and remained steadfast in his original plan, ordering the submarine to head towards Julia's camp. This decision infuriated Olshansky, who sharply reminded Victor that this was his second act of stubbornness, warning him that if this choice also proved to be a mistake, their entire mission, and perhaps their careers, would be over. The search for the sunken submarine stretched on, a tense and arduous endeavor, until the radar suddenly detected a mysterious entity hot on their tail once again. Being in the wide-open expanse of the ocean, with nowhere to hide, the crew immediately sent an emergency signal to the nearby oil rig. Fortunately, the workers granted them permission to take shelter there. Soon enough, Victor and his crew successfully outmaneuvered the colossal creature, evading its pursuit. But their relief was short-lived, as the creature dramatically surfaced near the platform, its gigantic tentacles emerging from the depths. The stunned oil rig workers, witnessing the horrifying sight, immediately sounded the alarm. The monstrous tentacles then began a devastating assault on the platform, tearing apart its structures and triggering a series of massive explosions. The horrific incident sent the workers into a frantic panic, but they were trapped, with nowhere to run in the middle of the vast ocean. Below, Victor abruptly lost contact with the oil rig. He quickly raised the periscope to observe the chaos unfolding on the surface. It was through its lens that he witnessed the giant tentacles seizing and pulling down the oil rig. Victor immediately projected the terrifying scene onto the main screen, ensuring Admiral Olshansky and the rest of the crew could plainly see the monstrous entity they were up against. After completely obliterating the oil rig, the creature shifted its focus, once again pursuing the submarine. They executed sharp, sudden turns to escape, causing equipment to crash and tumble inside the vessel. Olshansky, already at his wit's end, deemed Victor's decision to flee as his third major mistake. Seizing the opportunity, the admiral took command, opting for a direct confrontation. He ordered the firing of 2 torpedoes, both of which successfully struck the immense creature. However, their triumph was fleeting, as the monster was still very much alive and relentlessly continued its chase. They maintained their relentless assault, but it became clear that their conventional weapons were simply not enough to neutralize the colossal beast. Frustrated by the ineffectiveness of the attack, Victor decisively reclaimed command, ordering his crew to maneuver the submarine as swiftly as possible. Yet their evasive action proved futile, as one of the creature's massive tentacles slammed into their submarine, inflicting significant damage and causing several computer systems to short-circuit. The relentless assault continued, with the giant squid repeatedly striking the vessel until, catastrophically, an explosion erupted in the torpedo compartment, igniting a dangerous fire. 7 crew members were immediately dispatched to the affected area, battling the inferno with fire extinguishers. After a quick observation, it became abundantly clear that the massive beast had completely enveloped their submarine. Victor, thinking fast, ordered the crew into silent mode, knowing that most sea creatures, especially giant cephalopods, hunted by zeroing in on sounds. Luckily, Victor's gambit paid off, and the giant creature, seemingly losing its auditory target, eventually swam away. With the immediate threat gone, the crew could get back to their critical tasks. However, the fire in the torpedo compartment was still raging, spreading quickly and proving impossible to douse with just fire extinguishers. As the situation grew dire, Victor made the tough call, ordering his crew to evacuate the compartment and let their weapons burn. Several crew members sustained burns in the chaotic retreat. Oscar and Julia, despite their own ordeal, immediately jumped in to help treat the injured. Julia also tended to a gash on Victor's forehead, offering what comfort she could. Following the terrifying ordeal, a semblance of normalcy returned, and Victor and his crew gathered to discuss their next moves. A consensus quickly formed. Everyone agreed that heading back home was the sensible choice. They were still in the dark about the exact location of the sunken submarine, and the constant threat of the colossal creature lurking nearby was a chilling reminder of the dangers. While on their return journey, Victor pulled out a letter, the last one from his father, and began to read it. Just then, Julia entered his room, asking to see the submarine's maps and all the recorded locations where the Kraken had attacked. She explained that according to ancient legends, this giant squid often assaulted numerous ships in the past before suddenly vanishing, leading experts to theorize that the Kraken rested in deep slumber on the seabed. Based on this, Julia deduced that the explosives she and Oscar had dropped into the sea had inadvertently struck the Kraken's hiding place, thereby awakening the behemoth. She proposed that if they wanted to survive the creature's wrath, they absolutely had to deactivate the sonar, as its incessant pings would only draw the Kraken back to them. Julia further elaborated that squids and octopuses typically drag their prey back to their nests, which she believed were likely located close to her camp. Hearing Julia's compelling explanation, a new unsettling thought struck Victor. His brother's submarine might not have simply sunk, but could have been dragged by the Kraken to its lair. Mid-conversation, one of the crew members interrupted, excitedly reporting that they had stumbled upon a new clue. Victor was then urged to listen to an audio recording captured while they were in silent mode. In the recording, he distinctly heard a metallic pinging sound, like something tapping against metal. They quickly tracked the signal and found it was originating from an area eerily close to Julia's camp. The possibility dawned on them. The signal might have been sent by a survivor from the sunken submarine. After a quick discussion, everyone agreed to abandon their homeward-bound course and investigate the sunken submarine once more, setting a direct path for Julia's camp. During the journey, Victor found his thoughts drifting to his childhood, recalling a harrowing memory of getting lost in the mountains. As their submarine began its descent toward the seabed, the immense pressure of the ocean depths caused some small screws to loosen. Victor, noticing this, ordered the crew to bring the ship back up. After ascending slightly, they discovered a gaping, bottomless abyss. Not wanting to risk further severe damage to the main submarine, Victor and several crew members decided to transfer to a smaller, more robust submersible to investigate the abyss's crushing depths. Meanwhile, Admiral Olshansky took temporary command of the main submarine, As Victor and his small team began their slow, cautious descent into the abyss, the pressure inside the smaller submersible rapidly mounted. They knew they had a narrow window. If they didn't find anything quickly, they would have to resurface immediately to avoid catastrophic structural failure. As their smaller submersible finally reached the abyssal depths, Victor and his team were met with a chilling sight. Hundreds of sunken ships lay scattered across the seabed, a silent graveyard that terrifyingly confirmed Julia's theory about the Kraken carrying its prey to its nest. Eventually, they located the sunken submarine, noting significant external damage. They quickly secured their mini-sub to its hull and prepared to enter through the hatch. This proved to be no easy feat, as a powerful current churned within the wreckage. Luckily, their efforts paid off, and Victor immediately slipped inside. True to his desperate hope, his brother Alexander and several other crew members were still miraculously alive. Without a moment's hesitation, Victor began the arduous process of evacuating the survivors, simultaneously relaying the joyous news to the main submarine, which erupted in cheers of relief. Due to the mini-sub's confined space, it wasn't large enough to transport all the survivors in one go, necessitating multiple trips. Victor allowed some of them to go first, opting to stay behind with Alexander and a few others. They had, of course, installed a tracker in the area to easily relocate the sunken submarine, but they wisely deactivated the device shortly after, fearing its signals might reattract the Kraken's attention. A short while later, the first group of survivors arrived at the main submarine aboard the mini-sub and were immediately whisked inside for urgent medical treatment. However, the pilot, seemingly susceptible to the deep-sea conditions, began to suffer from severe seasickness. Recognizing the critical situation, Julia quickly turned to Oscar, who, having previous experience working on submarines, was the ideal candidate. Although initially hesitant and clearly afraid, Oscar ultimately agreed to take control of the mini-sub. As the small vessel detached and began its journey back to the sunken ship, Admiral Olshansky observed on the main submarine's radar that the Kraken was once again on the move, closing in fast. Meanwhile, back in the wrecked submarine, Victor and Alexander were painstakingly investigating the wreckage, aiming to retrieve the crucial weapons and the activation codes from the safe. When they attempted to input the codes into the compromised computer system, it remained unresponsive. Victor, however, was not one to give up easily. After a series of frantic button presses and determined efforts, he finally managed to jumpstart the computer, his face lighting up with relief as he confirmed the weapons were still functional. The electromagnetic waves generated by the reactivated submarine were also detected by the returning mini-sub, providing a clear beacon to guide them back to the sunken vessel. On the main submarine, the crew was gripped by terror as the Kraken rapidly approached. They immediately plunged deeper, initiating silent mode. However, the extreme pressure at the seabed depths began to loosen more screws, and water started to flood one of the compartments. The crew grew increasingly uncertain if they could survive much longer. Just then, the mini-sub managed to reach the sunken ship, but as they attempted to latch onto the submarine, they accidentally bumped the tracker, causing it to malfunction. Instantly, the Kraken sensed their presence and began swimming furiously towards them. Admiral Olshansky seized the moment, ordering his crew on the main submarine to steer the ship back to the surface, recognizing it as their only chance. Below, in the rapidly deteriorating sunken submarine, Victor was desperately crawling through a network of pipes, making his way towards the weapons in the torpedo room. Simultaneously, Alexander, hearing the approaching mini-sub finally dock, urgently told his remaining crew to board it immediately. Not long after, Victor burst into the weapons room and swiftly began entering the code into a torpedo. Meanwhile, Alexander was performing the same critical task on the computer, initiating the weapons loading sequence. They just needed a little more time for the weapon to arm, but the Kraken had already reached the submarine and launched a devastating attack. Victor and Alexander communicated frantically over the radio as the colossal creature began to tear apart their precarious sanctuary. Both brothers, in a poignant moment amidst the chaos, apologized for their past quarrels. As the Kraken, seemingly a sentient force of destruction, launched another furious strike, Victor and Alexander prepared to press the activation button simultaneously. With their synchronized action, the weapon finally became active. It unleashed an overwhelming energy that superheated the monstrous creature, causing it to explode in an incandescent blast. The resulting explosion was so immense, so powerful, that it visibly ripped through the ocean, seemingly penetrating the equator and reaching all the way into the atmosphere. As water began to flood the submarine, Victor immediately scrambled back through the pipe, reconnecting with Alexander. They had to move fast, as the weapons on board had been set to self-destruct. The submarine began to sink rapidly, and powerful waves crashing through the corridors separated the two brothers. But in a desperate twist of fate, Victor spotted Alexander's hand reaching out from the churning water. He instinctively grabbed it, pulling Alexander to safety beside him. The two brothers then frantically rushed towards the minisub, scrambling aboard. With only 2 minutes remaining before the catastrophic explosion, the minisub struggled, its release clamps failing to disengage. Luckily, Victor, in a flash of desperate memory, recalled an emergency lever. He yanked it with all his might, and the minisub finally launched, hurtling away just moments before the main weapon detonated in a thunderous roar. On the surface, the main submarine crew waited with bated breath for any sign of life. They had been waiting for so long that hope was beginning to dwindle. But then, to their immense relief, they saw a stream of bubbles break the surface, and moments later the mini-sub emerged, safe and sound. Everyone erupted in joyous cheers. Amidst the jubilation, Victor took out his father's watch and offered it to Alexander. However, Alexander gently refused, telling Victor to keep it himself. Soon after, the brothers arrived safely back in Russia, finally reuniting with their grateful families.